Hello, sorry for being late. All right, so let me get your names down. Thank you for attending. We're doing the West, right? The conquest of the West. So let's see here. Are there any questions as we get into this? I don't believe I've even put the assignment up yet, and I apologize. That will be up very shortly. And it will entail as well the questions that will pertain to test number 1 on the West. All right, great. All right, I have your names. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with this PowerPoint. All right. Now we'll be here forever if I go over every single sub point on here. So I won't do that. But notice right here, okay, for test number 1, we're going to go over Turner's thesis on the West. All right. Support for his thesis and critiques of his thesis. All right. So notice the critiques, theoretical issues with his thesis, Marxist history and its claims against his thesis, post-civil rights movement history or historiography, and then the fact that there was a lot of government aid goes against his thesis as well in the West. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Again, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself at any time should you have any questions for me, okay? All right, and so to him, right, to Turner, his thesis is that the West renewed American meritocracy. And of course, meritocracy, right, is you rise or fall by merit. And so that implying that the system is fair, that there's relative equality of opportunity. And you rise or fall by your own talent, your own hard work, and your own good or poor luck, okay? And so to him, that represents what America is all about. To him, that's Americana. And so the West is a microcosm, is a mini example of what is beautiful about America. So this is definitely court history. It's praising the West in particular. It's praising the country and contending, right, that it doesn't matter what your family name is. It doesn't matter what your ethnic background is. It doesn't matter how much money you were born into. That if you are talented, shrewd, diligent, or hardworking, and lucky enough, you can prevail in the West and in America. Okay, so are there any questions about his thesis? So he somewhat employs Darwinian theory and stating, right, that the West was rough and it was bound to weed out the weak, weed out the poor in luck, the unlucky. And if you were lucky and talented enough, it was, opportunities were there for the taking. Okay, so let's see here. So first of all, what I have is I have 2 categories basically that I have in these, that you could find in these slides, in the next few slides, and that is that there were dangers and there were opportunities alike in the West. But notice, right, at the root of his thesis is the assumption that the dangers, the obstacles, the opportunities were indiscriminate, right? That it didn't matter what your family name was, what the color of your skin was, what your gender was, etc. That although he didn't buy too much into into modern notions of gender equality. So he namely spoke about men. He wrote in the 1890s, not to make excuses for him. But at any rate, so that's what we're looking at here. So the Overland Trails, right? First of all, just moving there, you have differences of opinion, okay? Some people contend, all right, that there were a lot of people of the poor and working class of the East Coast and from elsewhere around the world who made it into the West, especially with the facilitation that the government helped provide. So you have the three overland trails, right? The Mormon or California Trail, the Oregon Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. And they kind of materialized organically from like the 1820s onward. And by the time of the end of the Civil War, and especially after the gold rush of the 1840s and 50s in California, they have been somewhat institutionalized. You had forts, federal forts that were there to protect and provide supplies to those who were in need, maps to help them find their way. You had the famous mountain men who made a lot of money off of offering their services to commandeer you and to lead you through the gaps of the Sierra Nevada, the South Pass, through the Rockies, etc., and find a safer route. And also were familiar with some of the Native American tribes that may or may not be hostile to your entrance into their territory. Because with the Native Americans, they were particularly angry because they were already beginning to become victimized by the reservation system from the time of the Trail of Tears in the 1830s from your 101 class. And so now you have the Treaty of Fort Atkins, you have the Medicine Lodge Treaty, you have Fort Laramie Treaty, and they're telling the Native American tribes where their reservation lands are now and where they are to stay and remain. They have limited rights to hunting grounds. Certain times of the year, they're to report to their reservation. They have them dependent upon annuities or annual supplies of shipment of the necessities of life, of food and drink and supply, medicinal supplies, etc. And so you have a contingent of many of the tribes that never was okay with this and never gave their approval to it. So they're already angry about it. And what makes it worse is as the Americans began flooding across on the overland trails, the government somewhat, I mean, there's no other way of putting it, the government rescinded or broke its word and said, okay, now we're going to force you in these treaties that I had mentioned, Fort Atkins, Medicine Lodge, Laramie. We're going to force you to grudgingly allow people to pass through. And there was a particular case of anger with Laramie because some of the people coming through were blatantly stopping and trying to begin homesteads or farms in that territory that was given to the Native American tribes that they weren't already happy about to begin with. And so a lot of the pioneers, they broke that promise and they began, stopping and staying and staking grounds on some of these lands. So needless to say, some of the Native American tribes attacked them. So you have the Kiowa in Kansas who were attacking the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific from the east, and they had to regularly ask the Union soldiers to come and help defend the workers. They hired their own soldiers or police, if you will, to fight the Kiowa off. The Crow gained an infamous reputation for extortion, that if you went, as well as the Shoshone, if you went through their territory in the Mandan Mountains or down with the Shoshone in the Sierra Nevada, they oftentimes would hold you at gunpoint and demand certain of your supplies, sometimes even your horses, your transportation, in return for your life. And the Sioux are going to fight pretty bitterly against the U.S. government. The Arapaho normally had been on good terms, but this was too far for them as well as the Cheyenne. And so these tribes, right? And then, of course, you have the infamous Apache and Comanche on the Santa Fe Trail are going to have cases in which they kill settlers that come through their land. And so you have dangers of Native American attacks. You have historian Candy Moulton, you have historian Clifford Westermeyer, other old school historians that really focus on the dangers of the West for pioneers and for cowboys, as we get to them shortly. But you have like the Bozeman Trail and other trails that the government is going to, and as well as the Transcontinental Railroad, that's going to help facilitate movement into the West. Also, the government deliberately kept land cheap, usually didn't go above $1.25 an acre. Of course, that was much more back then, but it was at least affordable, arguably. And then you had squatters' rights that we'll get into. So you have opportunities, but you have dangers, right? According to Frederick Jackson Turner, this historian in the 1890s. Then if you want to look for evidence of anarchy in the far West, you could definitely find it. You have cases in which, especially the cattle towns and the mining towns. The mining towns are pretty easy to surmise what those are, right? Where they'd find silver, gold, some type of bullion and minerals, and people would flood to that area. So after the Civil War, you have, nothing really on par, arguably, with the gold rush of 49, but you have the Comstock lode during and just after the Civil War in Nevada. Lots of millions of dollars worth of, over $20 million worth of silver was extracted from that. And you had some bonanza kings. Some people went from kind of rags to riches. You have Idaho and Montana, and you have the Dakotas, where they found silver and gold and people rushed to them. And then you also have the cattle towns. And the person that's famous for one of the first cattle towns is Joseph McCoy. He established Abilene, Kansas, and it was the nearest depot in the West from which a lot of cowboys would go down into Texas and find roaming free wild cattle and bring them on a drive anywhere from 300 to almost 1,000-mile trip that entailed many dangers, according to Westermeyer and Candy Moulton and other old school historians. You could be stampeded by the cattle. You could be stampeded by buffalo there at any given time. There were at one time, there were tens of millions of buffalo roaming as well. You had accidents that could happen. You had the vagaries of the weather. You had disease, of course. And so at any rate, you would take it up to the nearest town where you could sell your cattle per head. And Abilene was one of the first famous ones. Dodge City, of course, was really infamous. And so when they would come there, they would be paid per head of cattle. And sometimes the profit ratio, according to some historians, could get as high as 800% as far as what you paid for the cattle, or sometimes just free if it wasn't branded. And if you just captured one down in Texas and you took it up one of the famous trails, like the Chisholm Trail, you would find your way to Abilene, to Dodge City, etc., and get paid handsomely for your cattle. And then suddenly you'd have all this money on you. And then you would have entrepreneurs, right? Business owners that were licking their lips, waiting to take that money immediately from you. And so the cattle towns developed a reputation for lawlessness and revelry, bordellos with prostitutes, gambling dens, and and you had names for places like the Devil's Half Acre in Abilene, a red light district, an area of gambling and drinking and etc. So at any rate, in the mining towns and in the cattle towns, they particularly developed a reputation for lawlessness because they were rising ad hoc, these cities, so they hadn't established yet an infrastructure with a police department, a sheriff or constable, county government, etc., because they were brand new towns. And so at any rate, you have this, this whole genre of Western movies and Western dime store novels, etc., that really, in some ways, according to historians like Carl Metz, exaggerate just how dangerous these towns were. But we do have evidence. We have clear-cut cases of there definitely violence erupting. And so at any rate, you had the famous Dalton gang, and they were chased by a vigilante group all the way down to the Texas border and shot and killed. And those are their bodies there, trying to demonstrate to the people of Kansas and elsewhere, if you don't abide by the law, if you try to, victimize our people of our city, we'll get you back. Baxter and Caldwell in New Mexico, they deputized every person, and they have manifestos stating that they were tired of roaming cowboys and outlaws coming in and terrorizing the population. So they were thereby deputizing everybody in town to be able to willingly shoot an outlaw at will. I mean, that's crazy. That's the stuff of a Western movie for sure. The Shirley gang, you could look that story up, and it's semi-comical. If it didn't entail deaths, it would be comical. But at any rate, while they were robbing the bank, a gentleman who owned an all-purpose store across the street from the bank began giving out guns to everybody in town in Meeker, Colorado. And they had women in petticoats up on top of roofs sniping at the men when they came out of the bank. And they ended up getting most of the members of that gang, the people of the town itself. And so you definitely have that notion of it. And then, of course, you have the demographic component that a lot of the cowboys that came in were young and single. And a lot of them also, I don't know how much relevance this bears, but a lot of them were Southerners. And they collectively, like Jesse James, have a reputation for having a chip on their shoulder for having lost the Civil War and for radical Reconstruction that was going on in the South. And so there was the notion that, this was an especially rowdy demographic that moved to these mining towns and cattle towns. But do you have evidence of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of police force, evidence for a scarcity of courts and court system, and just, law and order, if you will? Absolutely. You could definitely find evidence of that in the West that arguably supports Turner's thesis of this rowdy, rough, dangerous, but opportunity-laden West. Okay. And then you also have, well, this is a little bit redundant here, but you have a blurred line between law and order. You look up Tom Bear River Smith, you look up Wild Bill Hickok, especially in places like Abilene and Dodge City, in these cattle towns that were hired as the sheriffs. And they had personal feuds that they would take advantage of their power and their badge, and they even killed people. Hickok himself killed about 8 people while he was sheriff. Some of them were personal, like a guy named Davis Tutt. He supposedly got in an argument with over a wristwatch that he lost in a poker match. Not a wristwatch, a pocket watch. And so at any rate, you can find evidence of a kind of a anomalous, right? Out of the ordinary Wild West, if you will. The mining towns, like I said, you have here in Knowlton's book, initially the cattle towns lacked courts, police, and jails, right? The authority of the national government was merely in name, according to, in the Comstock area, according to that historian. I can't see his last name right now, but I'll put this online, okay? This PowerPoint, this old PowerPoint. But there was money to be made. In the 1860s, Virginia City in Nevada, $135 million worth of mainly silver was extracted. And there were bonanza kings like John Mackay and James Fair, James Flood, William O'Brien, who went from rags to riches. The Comstock lode yielded 300 million, Montana 20 million, etc. Right? And so, so you did have mining opportunities. You had cattle opportunities if you were willing to engage in the cattle trade. And then this is just further example of a Wild West with judges and lawmen throwing their weight around and not exactly giving due process to people therein. You had outlaws, right? Billy the Kid, who John Wesley Hardin, who killed multiple lawmen before they themselves were killed by lawmen. So, you know, the whole outlaw motif, you know, it definitely, like I said, historians like Karl Metz, they contend that it's exaggerated, and probably so. Matter of fact, one historian that I was just reading contends that the crime rate was no higher than it was in the eastern seaboard cities, especially New York. That New York's murder rate and violent criminal rate was just as high, if not higher, than it was in the cattle towns, and that gunfights were not as common as you would think. But nevertheless, like I said, you have cases of the Lincoln County War, right, in New Mexico, with Billy the Kid, with a corrupt sheriff, and other people trying to get the cattle contract with the local armed forces to sell their cattle for profits instead of a Scottish immigrant that Billy the Kid was working for that outbid them. And they just downright murdered him, Billy the Kid's boss. And so he ended up killing the sheriff. I don't know if he did personally, but he went on a raid and was a part of the killing of the sheriff. And things got crazy. And Wyatt Earp, right, his famous story from Tombstone and Dodge City, where he took on enemies while he carried the badge, personal enemies who had killed his brother Morgan and wounded Virgil, his other brother. And yeah, and so you can find that. And all that does arguably, limitedly support Turner's thesis of a Wild West that was also laden with opportunities. And then the Homestead Act, right, of 1862 granted 160 acres of free land, right? If you promise to grow trees and pay a tax for a local school system, you can get an additional 160 acres, according to historian Paul Johnson. And on the prairies and on the plains of the U.S. And look at this, a lot of them were immigrants. Over 300,000 Danish immigrants came and received land. Norwegians, etc. So a lot of Scandinavian immigrants came, so much so that parts of Nebraska and elsewhere on the plains became known as the Swedish wheat belt and gained names as such. And so the government, of course, they contend had an ulterior motive, is they were trying to, one, vie with Native Americans and try to take their land, and outnumber them in the West. And two, of course, they were trying to populate the West with loyal Yankees, because you had to pledge Union loyalty to the Union above, as opposed to the Confederacy during the Civil War, in order to receive this land. But homesteaders, right? Like I said, Paul Johnson, in his book, he's a court historian. You got to keep that in mind. He praises all things U.S. Predominantly in his book, so he's very biased. But he contends that he challenges other historians to find a comparable case of such government generosity, benevolent generosity, he calls it, to the people in granting so much free land to so many people, including immigrants. All right. And then, but mind you, there's a problem with that, is in some cases, the railroads, if they came through and the swath of land that was granted to these railroads contrasted, it wasn't supposed to on paper, but sometimes it did, contrasted with your claims and your land, they had rights over you. Also, land speculators would gobble up as much land around you and put pressure on you to sell your land to them. Water rights and access to water was difficult in the plains. And so sometimes people literally couldn't live off their farm. You also sometimes were isolated if you were away from railroad tracks and you wanted to go beyond being a merely subsistence farmer and growing your own food and actually try to make money and being a cash crop farmer and focusing on one cash crop, mainly it was wheat on the plains, then you were isolated from any markets. And what the railroads would do is they would charge you. If they knew you were isolated, they had you. They had you where they wanted you, and they would exorbitantly put up their price for you. They wouldn't keep the same price for everybody. There weren't laws that stated that yet. And so, so there were definitely ways in which the little guy on these homesteads faced some major obstacles in receiving this free land. Okay. And then another way of receiving free land was by squatters' rights, right? And that was popularized and institutionalized into our court systems during Jackson's time period in your 101 class in the 1830s, whereby you would contend that the land that you came across was not being cultivated, was not being used, and you had improved it and farmed and cultivated it. And so by squatters' rights, you demand the right to either purchase it or even have it handed to you for free by the government. And there was wiggle room between those two extremes too, of having the first right to purchase it and having the right to just have it granted to you for free. There were other areas in the middle, but at any rate, it was collectively known as squatters' rights. So there were opportunities to mine for silver and gold and other minor minerals, to mine the miners and mine the cattle, the cowboys in the mining towns and the cattle towns, to find some type of commodity or service that was wanted by them and provide it to them in those mining towns and cattle towns. You could make money that way. And then, of course, there was access to land, free land via the Homestead Act and via sometimes squatters' rights. So at any rate, in some of the Great Lake and Midwestern cities, again, immigrants, in this case, Germans, came in and did very well for themselves just before, during, and after the Civil War. And so this, is praised by court historians as examples of this being the land of opportunity, right? As well as the Jewish community. We're going to get further into that when we get to the next subject of the Gilded Age, all right? But again, you see here the different nationalities: Russians, Poles, Austrians, Romanians, Slovaks, Serbs, Croatians, Bulgarians, Jews came, and 13 million foreign-born by 1910, and some of them came into the West, in particular the Great Lakes area of Minnesota and Wisconsin, and into the cities that connected East and West, like St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago, Illinois, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. All right. So yeah, I don't want to get too much into that because, again, this overlaps with the Gilded Age, what we're doing next. All right. So the cattle industry, the three main drives from southern Texas to get this sometimes free cattle, you guys, roaming cattle from the time of the Spanish conquistadores, Vasquez de Coronado in around 1540, left thousands of head of cattle and horses, and they multiplied throughout the centuries, a couple centuries or 3 centuries. And it got up to the millions of roaming, free, wild cattle and horses. So the Goodnight Loving, named after the last names of these two gentlemen, the Sedalia Trail into Missouri, and the Chisholm Trail into Abilene from southern Texas. As you see here, by 1867, there were about 40,000 cowboys, or 40,000 cattle, I'm sorry, and about 50,000 cowboys coming out of Texas, coming into the cattle towns to sell a head of cattle. And you see here, right? Oftentimes the cattle could have been free if you were willing to go through the hardships of going on the cattle drive and finding an unbranded cow or bull or steer, etc. And so look at this. Oftentimes, even a nice 1,000-pound steer could be just $10 a head, even if you just needed to purchase it. And it could cost up to $75 in Chicago, the butcher town. Cincinnati and Chicago became the butcher towns for pigs and for cattle, respectively. Cincinnati for pork and Chicago for beef. And so that's a good profit margin. All right. The dangers inherent, like I mentioned, Westermeyer and Candy Moulton. There were plenty of dangers in the cowboy's life. Okay. The problem is, though, right, is the railroads are going to eventually extend all the way into the West, and the need for that drive is going to end. Also, there was, however many of millions, there was a finite number of cattle, so they were eventually claimed. And so at that point, then the cowboy's heyday arguably ended. And then the cowboy became known as just a ranch hand on a wealthy cattleman's ranch, getting paid a regular salary instead of like his own entrepreneur selling cattle and bringing it from one place to the next. And so that brought about kind of the end of the mystique and the romanticism connected to being a cowboy. So at any rate, but even so, if you aspired to be a cattle rancher, again, it was oftentimes no more than $1.25 an acre, and you oftentimes had squatters' rights. So the chances were there. And I already mentioned the entrepreneurial opportunities in cattle towns to provide some good or service that was coveted by the cowboys as they were getting paid handsomely. So what are some problems with Turner's thesis? Okay, we kind of supported it. For one, the idea that a rugged frontier will automatically kind of organically produce a more democratic, everyone on equal footing, the term is egalitarian society, doesn't seem to be true. Look at the frontier in Brazil, look at the frontier in Argentina. It didn't produce an egalitarian democratic society. And in his book, he tries to convey that it's almost a scientific law that rugged frontiers will produce that type of society. So some people have a problem with that theory right off the bat. Okay. And then, of course, others contend that the West was not nearly as dangerous as it's depicted, because oftentimes, right, the press ran with stories in these cattle towns and mining towns, sometimes with an ulterior motive to scare people out of that mining town or cattle town and to have them come to their town. It's probably not a coincidence that you had places like, like in Deadwood of Dakota, and it was contended that it was such an awful place by the press in Idaho and Montana. And what do you know? Idaho and Montana were vying with the Dakotas, competing with them and trying to get miners to come to their area. And so sometimes it was a product of exaggeration and taken out of context. And then equality of opportunity was more relative than absolute. Having equal opportunity for everybody, that maybe there were arguably more opportunities for more people than elsewhere, like let's say back on the East Coast of the United States, so relative to other places, compared to other places. But just saying that there was equality of opportunity, some historians, goes way too far. And we'll get into some of that right now. So for one was big money, right? You look at the railroads, and they are depicted oftentimes in books as the bullies of the West. For one, namely, was their political capital, the connections they had with Congress and with the federal government. So look at there, right? Like with the Union Pacific, they opened up 100,000 shares, but one share was $1,000. And that was back then. Who had the money to buy a share worth $1,000? The Central Pacific, when they raised money here in Sacramento, they went to the wealthiest of the politicians and entrepreneurs and the well-connected only to try to raise money for this. Howard Zinn contends that both the Central and the Union Pacific received about 10 million acres for free of land on both sides of the tracks as a subsidy to help them pay for the expenses of the railroad, right? So each of them, one was like 9 million, the other one was like 11 million. of free acres, right, of land granted to them to do as they wished with. They each were given about 50, and I'm not exaggerating, $50 million worth in bonds, people lending money to the government and expecting their money back with interest. The government issued bonds to help the railroads out, to pay for the expenses. So, if you're a small mom and pop shop, I can't say it without laughing. How in the world are you going to contend against the Union or Central Pacific? They're just too well connected, and they're too subsidized. They're too financially assisted by the federal government. And again, they have a priority. So Muscle Slough in Southern California, there were a group of squatters who were granted rights to that land. And I think it was the Santa Fe and Topeka Railroad that came into town and said, sorry, guys, get off your plots. And they said, no, a local judge granted them to us by squatters' rights. They said, well, too bad. Congress trumps the local judge. And the Congress gave, a certain number of acreage on each side of the tracks to us instead of to you. And some of them refused to get off. So the railroad flexed its muscles and got the government to bring a contingent of army men and a marshal, etc. And they even actually had a small gunfight before they forcefully removed these squatters off their lands, which they thought had been given to them, because the railroad flexed its muscles and wanted that land and claimed that land instead. And so you had cases like that. You literally had bribe money. That Durant of the Union Pacific and Collis Huntington of the Central Pacific came to Washington literally with bribe money, and they had some gentlemen in their pockets, so to speak. You had a McDougal, Senator McDougal, and House Rep. Oh gosh, what was his name? It's eluding me. I apologize. But they literally had congressmen and senators, House reps and senators, who were making laws on subsidizing them and helping them, who suddenly gained access to a certain number of shares in their company. That clearly they were bribed, right? A kind of a quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours deal. And so you had stuff like this happening. Each railroad also hired its own companies to do the construction. And what do you know, like the big four that controlled the Central Pacific, as well as Durant and his men in the Union Pacific, they opened up their own phony construction companies that was owned by themselves, so that they could get paid themselves as the construction company, using bond money and other stock subscriptions and other people's money to pay themselves to do the construction. And if that's not bad enough, sometimes they got inflated prices for their commodities because they were their own purchaser, and they were purchasing it with the public's money. And but their money as well, don't get me wrong. Some of these big railroad tycoons went through a period in which they were almost going broke, supposedly, but still a lot of other people's money as well that they were able to play with. And in some cases, they gave themselves phony constructions of bridges that never were built, and they just pocketed their own money. And so that was famous as the Credit Mobilier scandal. And so, you have that going on with big business and with the railroads in particular. Corporate and cattle ranches, the big guys, Richard King, Mr. Stillman, these big ranches, right? They came and they were just able, by economies of scale, like Walmart, just to undersell at a lower price their farm commodities against the smaller guys. They also utilize graft. They use political inside information to find out where railroads were going to be built, where cities and new markets would arise, and they bought their land accordingly in strategic places, right? And so they just had the connections, they had the money, these big cattle ranchers, and they began with barbed wire fences to fence off their areas, and cattlemen couldn't just, roaming independent entrepreneurial cowboys could no longer just graze wild cattle through their lands, but they would close their lands off. They would buy, tens or hundreds of thousands of head of cattle, and have these great deals with the railroads and the slaughtering companies in Chicago and elsewhere to have their cattle sent and purchased. And so it was tough. It was tough to go against them. And one demographic that really found that out the hard way were the Hispanics. You look at the Mexican-American War. It was promised at the end of the war in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that Mexican Americans were citizens entitled to their life, liberty, and property, and all the rights thereof. But a lot of them were bullied off their ranches. So you look at some of the big ranch barons of Southern California, the Nieto family, the Verdugos. You look at some of the big names in New Mexico, and especially in Texas, and they were bullied in one way or another off of much of their lands. They had to show just precise proof of ownership of every square inch of all the boundaries of their proclaimed property. They had high lawyer fees. In some cases, like Stillman, he would take them repeatedly to court just to drain them by way of court fees into submission. And so you had that issue and problem as well. The cattle ranchers had ways of flexing their muscles. And you see there, right? Harvesting an acre of wheat entailed 61 hours of labor before the Civil War. After the Civil War, it entailed only 3 hours and 19 minutes. So you have the mechanical reapers and threshers and harvester combines. Those are expensive machines that the average person could not afford and couldn't hang with the corporate farmers either. So corporations came and they flexed their money, they flexed their capital, their money to play with, right? They flexed their political connections, their political capital. And they did it as corporate miners, they did it as corporate ranchers, and they did it as corporate farmers. And oftentimes, right, this goes against Turner's thesis, right? This is Marxist history contending that the wealthy prevailed, just like they did everywhere else, that the West was no different. All right, and so then you had the Granger movements and the populist movement grow up as a retaliation, as a response to this. They were furious, the small scale farmers. So they tried to politically organize and run candidates for office, even to the point of at one point forming a third political party at the national level and running presidential candidates for the presidency. And of course, none of them won, but they darn sure tried. And so Granger units, you can find evidence of that here in the Central Valley of California, little Granger buildings when you go down to Newman and Patterson and other small agricultural towns down in the Dairy Valley, if you will. And so the Granger units, they would get together and they would try to collectively help one another to give themselves a fighting chance against the big farmers. They would share secrets, they would share equipment, they would share money or capital, they would share credit, and they would try to collectively fight against the big guys. And look at this, they wanted laws that would regulate the rates of the middlemen. So for storing their stuff, for transporting their farm produce, they were tired of the middlemen sticking it to them with high prices. They wanted laws that would put a price ceiling above which they could not charge any farmer. And they even went so far as wanting to nationalize railroads and get the federal government to control the railroad system. And so they flirted with, elements of socialism. And they had very fiery populist rhetoric, anti-rich, anti-establishment, anti-bankers, anti-big city, et cetera, et cetera. And so they also had a legacy of being a little bit, as being seen as a little bit archaic, intolerant, bigoted. But at the same time, they tried to convey an image of being the common would-be cash crop farmer, right? Trying to chase after the American dream. In corporate mining, the same thing, air-powered and water-powered pneumatic and hydraulic drills. Those were very expensive. The average miner could nowhere near afford that. And if you look at our textbook, it contends that most of the mineral wealth that was extracted from the mines in the 1800s were minor minerals like copper, etc., and were extracted by heavy machinery owned by corporations. So oftentimes people went to Montana, Idaho, the Dakotas to try to strike it rich, but instead ended up working hourly wages for a corporation that had the rights to the mineral wealth, and all they had were hourly wages, oftentimes without any type of commission in finding gold or silver or copper, etc., for their company, for their employer. And then Chinese immigrants in particular were extremely exploited. There's a book called Strangers from a Different Shore. Great book. I given it out to a student and I didn't get it back, so I'm trying to get it as well. So otherwise I would read a couple quotes to you. But it's an incredible book, very interesting on the plight of Asian immigrants and Asian Americans in American history. And yeah, I believe it's Strangers from a Different Shore. So at any rate, by Ronald Takaki. In it, right, he shows the push and pull factors that brought the Chinese from China predominantly the Guangdong province to predominantly California, and over 14,000 worked for the Central Pacific Railroad, were hired by Charles Crocker of the Big Four of the Central Pacific, and 1,200 of them died in the construction of the Central Pacific, going through the Sierra Nevada. Explosions, snow avalanches, cave-ins, exhaustion, hypothermia, you name it. And so at any rate, they came in and they developed a reputation for being diminutive, for being physically small. So they would put them in these very small areas, hang them in reed baskets over the edge of cliffs and over the edge of Sierra Nevada mountains, and just make them do very dangerous work. And they also developed a reputation for being docile. And docile, right, is you're meek, you're humble, you do as you're told, and you're not defiant, and you're not entitled. And sadly, the employers kind of licked their lips with that and thought that's the perfect type of exploitable laborer that we could take advantage of. And not to mention diligent and efficient, hardworking and quick at what they did. So Crocker even had a famous bet as to how much track his Chinese laborers could lay in a single day, and it was publicized throughout the country and gave them a good name as workers, etc. But you're going to find that an irony here is when you go forward to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, passed by Congress, literally in that act, you could find language that is complimentary to the Chinese, basically describing that they are the ideal workers. But therefore, right, it contends that the American people are frightened of them taking their job, of being able to do their same job more quickly, more effectively, and more cheaply being willing to accept a lower wage. And anytime there's an entire demographic or population, right, category of the population that's willing to work for less, that takes away from your power as a union to strike, right? Because therein lies the power of the strike, is saying if you don't pay us better, no one's going to get this job done. And so the Chinese were used in divide and conquer tactic fashion as kind of just that, of divide and conquering. And they would bring them in as scab or substitute workers during strikes. And this, just needless to say, exacerbated public anti-Chinese sentiment. They called them Celestials or Mongolians at that time. So at any rate, yeah, things were very tough for the Chinese immigrants. So in 55, there was a special tax on passengers ineligible for citizenship, right? In 58, an act to prevent the further immigration of Chinese Mongolians to California. Ultimately, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Look at this. In 1870, Congress declared that Asians are unfit for naturalization, so they cannot ever apply for and receive citizenship. Pretty sad. 1865 to 69, over 1,200 of the Chinese immigrant laborers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. And then you compound that with the yellow peril fear, is that so many of the Chinese laborers came just as men. And there was, the press ran with the story that some of them were marrying white Irish immigrant girls and American girls, and that they were going to, quote, bastardize the American gene pool. I mean, this kind of stuff was actually stated and actually feared at that time. They called it the mongrelization of American blood. So some ugly stuff, right? And Turner doesn't pay heed to this stuff. He kind of conveniently ignores it. All right, so I've already done that. Let's see here. So Latinos or Hispanics, right? They were somewhat pigeonholed into the proletariat, and proletariatization is the term, right? So what I mean by pigeonholed is, for one, it was basically the only jobs they could get were with menial labor, low paid civil service, manual labor jobs that didn't pay well, that didn't offer much opportunity for advancement, okay, as far as the American dream goes. And also that they were stigmatized culturally, that is where they belong. That's the proper niche for them to live in. And all is right in the world for them staying there. So much for equality of opportunity, right? So you had discrimination by law, de jure, and then just in reality, outside the law, de facto discrimination and segregation. And what were some responses to this proletarianization? Some Hispanics or Latinos fought within the system as politicians, as businessmen in particular, for their rights and their opportunities. Some fought beyond the system, like the famous bandidos, like Joaquin Murrieta and others who kind of like Jesse James of the South, contended that their deviance, and I mean that in the sociological sense, deviating from norms and committing crimes, was not just a product of criminal psychology and behavior, but that it was political, that it was meant to be a political statement against the, quote, system. And then cultural maintenance. Latinos have maintained their culture very effectively for a group that has been, for a long time, arguably pigeonholed into the proletariat, into the laboring, lower working class echelon. Okay. So vaqueros, right? Daily ranch hands or cowboys, especially in Texas and Colorado. They did not receive very good wages in doing this. And a lot of Mexican immigrants came as well. So, Coahuila, Chihuahua, Durango, they went to Texas. Sinaloa, Sonora, and areas just beneath California went to California. And now you're having the issue at the turn of the 1900s, the issue of Mexican immigration, because there was a demand for exploitable, cheap labor in southern Texas by farmers, right? By cash crop, collective, corporate farmers wanting to exploit laborers. And by the way, in California, it began, but the process was a little slower. In the mid to late 1800s, most of the exploited laborers were actually still Asian, as a remnant of the coolie system from Hawaiian Islands of Asian laborers. A lot of them in particular were not only Chinese and Japanese, but a lot of them were Filipino here in California. And so at any rate, you had exceptions. Oh, and then also the Anaconda copper mines, the Santa Fe and Topeka railroads employed a lot of Mexican laborers and exploited them. They worked as cooks, cleaners, janitors, etc., in border towns like Corpus Christi. And you always had exceptions, a Mexican bourgeoisie, people of the city who were of the middle class, right? Who had either were the intelligentsia, who were college educated, or were entrepreneurs, business owners, or merchants, or bankers. And you had the existence of a Hispanic bourgeoisie in Los Angeles, San Antonio, and Tucson, Arizona, for instance, as well as a couple cities like Santa Fe in New Mexico. This quote says that there developed a hierarchy amongst Mexican Americans, and some of them worked as brokers or middlemen to exploit poor common immigrants and poor common Mexican Americans in the fields by the late 1800s. All right. Like I said, I'll post this. You had border wars or merchant wars. And there was anger that Mexican merchants were going across this fluid line of the Rio Grande, and they were making great money off of peddling, of selling a commodity on both sides of the border. And so violence ensued, vigilante violence against Mexican merchants. And then the Mexicans began to strike back. You can look up the gorras blancas, the white hats. They and sometimes put on caps and engaged in destructive, behavior. They would cut through rich corporate guy ranches, barbed wire fences, and let their cattle out and steal their cattle. And of course, they were contending that these cattle ranchers were blood-sucking parasites themselves, and that they deserved it, right? They fought for the collective land ownership claimed in New Mexico and other areas where Mexican people were claiming collective land together. And then they ran for office, the gorras blancas gentlemen, and some won and tried to make change through the system for Hispanic Americans. And so at any rate, you have all this going on. And all this goes against, right, Turner's thesis, because he stated that there was equality of opportunity for everybody. Well, clearly there were discriminatory obstacles put before Asian Americans, Mexican Americans. And in this case, I didn't even go over African Americans. And needless to say, that's another group that had obstacles thrown in its way as far as the American dream or access to it. Violence, as you see here. The populace, right, trying to organize the small cash crop farmers. They would not allow Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants to unionize with them. And then there was vigilantism, the Salt War of 1877, Gregorio Cortez, Juan Chano Cortina, like I said, Joaquin Murrieta. Then Native Americans. Supposedly the reservation system was kind of an ad hoc improvisation, according to Richard White, historian, that there was just a continual lust for their lands. And you see that with the Trail of Tears episode in your 101 course. You see them removed, the 5 civilized tribes removed to Arkansas and Oklahoma and to Indian territory. You see with the Kiowa, with the Transcontinental Railroad being built there in Kansas, whereby they start, again, I'm going to name some of the same treaties, Medicine Lodge, Fort Atkins, Laramie. There were a couple at Laramie where they began trying to improvise and say, okay, now you Native American tribes are going to stay on this area in the far west, and that is to be yours indefinitely. But then they would go back on their word and say, well, wait a minute, gold has been found, has been discovered. We can't stop miners and settlers from going through your territory. So now you have to begrudgingly allow them passage through your territory. And there wasn't good enforcement when the people were not just passing through, but actually tried to stay in that territory and put up claims to a farm, a ranch, a cabin, etc. And so, the American government was not good on keeping its word and kind of throwing its weight around. Another thing that makes it look like an unethical narrative is that the most of these treaties, the rightful leaders, some of them at least, were not okay with these decisions and refused to touch the white man's pen and sign these agreements. And you have leaders of the bureaucracy of the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was under the Secretary of the Interior, under the president himself. And then, of course, the armed forces of the west of the Missouri River. And that was given at one time to infamous people like Philip Sheridan, who was famous for saying the only good Indian I knew was a dead Indian. And so at any rate, they made some very arbitrary decisions of throwing their weight around and contending, I don't care if you didn't sign the treaty. Your tribe has to abide by it. I don't care if the annuities that we promised you are not coming in. You can't leave the reservation and hunt for your own food. And so in some cases, the U.S. just very, very blatantly, easily could be molded into the villain, into the bully villain in a narrative of Native American and U.S. relations. So let's see here. So, yeah, and then you had the Sioux Wars. And again, at Laramie, for instance, you had Spotted Tail, who said, okay, fine, with his portion of the Sioux. And Red Cloud said, no way, we're not allowing the white man to come through, and we're certainly not okay with the Bozeman Trail, a series of federal military forts coming through the territory we had just been given indefinitely. And so Red Cloud and his men left the meeting at Laramie. Spotted Tail said, okay, fine, but he wasn't happy about it. And before it concluded, one of the Sioux diplomatic leaders came back with evidence of settlers stopping and intending to stay in that territory instead of just passing through. And it was a group of hundreds of them. And so it brought about a great sense of indignation, of like righteous anger amongst the Sioux present, and many of them refused to sign. Well, Spotted Tail was seen as an emasculated kiss-up or sellout to the paleface, to the white man. And many of his own followers amongst the Sioux left him and joined Red Cloud in the contingent of angry Native Americans that were not okay with the Bozeman Trail and with white settlement coming into their lands. Then if that weren't bad enough, gold was discovered in Montana, and it was publicized. And so now thousands of white settlers began illegally going into Sioux territory to find gold. And so at any rate, some of the Sioux, they were given an ultimatum, nevertheless, to stay on their reservations. So back in Minnesota, they were starving and not getting what they needed. So they went off and hunted instead. And on their way back, in a fit of rage, they got in an altercation with a private citizen and killed him and killed a handful of American citizens. When they came back to the reservation, they were to be severely punished, and it started a war. In the war, this Sioux War, one of a couple of two or three of them, spread, right? The conch shell, so to speak, was spread across the plains to the Cheyenne and the Arapaho allies. And so at Sand Creek in Colorado, Governor Evans and Colonel Shivington, who were very racist by today's standards against Native Americans, they took advantage of the advent of war all the way back in Minnesota, and there in Colorado said that we're going to attack the Cheyenne because they're allies and we're formally at war. The U.S. government is, and they attacked a non-violent, practically defenseless group and massacred hundreds of them at Sand Creek. It was known as the Sand Creek Massacre. So word spreads of that further exacerbates things. And then Red Cloud and a young man named, not Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, they began attacking the forts at Bozeman Trail, and they do so successfully. And they killed Fetterman and his men, and the press gets a hold of this. So both sides are feeding the xenophobic fear of the other. And by the way, Red Cloud went on a speaking tour of the East Coast, trying to convince Americans how corrupt our government was and how it was mistreating the Sioux and the other Native American tribes, but to no avail. So at any rate, we sued for peace momentarily. I kid you not, another component to the Sioux Wars happened over a fight over a darn cow. I kid you not. And a Brule chief was killed. And then the Brule Sioux retaliated and killed, I think it was Grattan and his men. And so you had isolated incidents. You had broken promises on behalf of the U.S. government. You had continual infiltration of American migrants going into the territory. You had the fact that a lot of the actual leaders and members of the tribes never were okay with and never truly gave their consent in these treaties to begin with. And it's all just a recipe for disaster. All right. And so, then when Philip Sheridan takes over, he decides, if you were not on your reservation at, I believe it was a spring, at a certain part of the year, then you were to be declared to be a hostile and you could be shot on sight or at least arrested and brought back to your reservation. So Red Cloud and others and those who left Spotted Tail and those who were following Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse began congregating in the Powder River Valley of Montana, near Hardin, Montana today, near the Little Bighorn, right, Creek. So at any rate, they knew that the government was going to come and attack them for not being on their reservations. And that's when infamously Custer and his men came in, and Custer plays the role of the quintessential arrogant paleface, thinking he could come in with inferior numbers and prevail. And he and his men were wiped out at Little Bighorn in late June of 1876. It's a tragic and very, very interesting story. I've had the chance myself to go to the site of the massacre, and it is something else. So at any rate, so after that, especially, there developed a crusade under Philip Sheridan to put an end to the Defiant Indians, if you will. All right. So, I mean, look at this. John Pope to Minnesota massacres. It is my purpose to utterly exterminate the Sioux. William Sherman to Fetterman called for total extermination if necessary. Right. So at any rate, after that, the Sioux were going to break up in numbers and they're going to be tracked down one group after the other. A group that held on pretty well for a long time were the Apache under Geronimo and other leaders. And there's just so much material, you guys. I choose not to get into that long story, if that's okay with you. So at any rate, are there any questions? Any questions at all? Morgan. I'll check my names again. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and let you go for the week. I'll have the assignment up very shortly and ask you to do the same thing, to analyze and evaluate the section of your choosing. But please be sure to read all the sections, okay? Any last minute questions? All right, you guys are quiet. I hope that's a good thing, that you're just on top of this. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and call it a week. I have your names down. You'll get your extra credit for this, okay? Thank you.